January 24th, 1945. A frozen irrigation ditch near Houssen, France. The telephone receiver felt like ice against First Lieutenant Garlin Murl Conner's ear as he whispered coordinates into it, his breath forming small clouds in the sub-zero air. Around him, the earth shook with incoming artillery fire, not from the enemy, but from American guns he himself was directing onto his own position. In a letter discovered decades later, he would describe this moment simply, "I knew what had to be done. The boys behind me had families waiting. If those tanks got through, none of us would make it home." Through the morning mist, Conner had just witnessed something that contradicted every assumption about defensive warfare. 6 massive German Mark 6 Tiger tanks, each weighing 54 tons and bristling with an 88mm cannon, were advancing directly toward the shallow ditch where he lay. Behind them came 600 battle-hardened German infantrymen, veterans of the Eastern Front, moving with the confidence of men who believed victory was within reach. Conner, a Kentucky farmer's son with only an 8th-grade education, was about to make a decision that military theorists would study for decades to come. 400 yards behind him, the men of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, had taken defensive positions. They were exhausted, cold, and facing an overwhelming force. What none of them knew at that moment was that their survival would depend entirely on the courage of one man lying in a ditch who was willing to call death down upon himself. The mathematics of this battle would defy every conventional tactical doctrine. One man, armed only with a telephone and artillery coordinates, would stop an entire armored column. Born on June 2, 1919, on Indian Creek in Clinton County, Kentucky, Garlin Murl Conner came from a world that seemed impossibly distant from the frozen fields of France. He was the 3rd of 11 children in a family that worked a subsistence farm in the Appalachian foothills. His parents called him by his middle name, pronounced Murl, and it was the name that would stick with him throughout his life. The nearest high school was 15 miles away over rough mountain roads, an impossible journey for a boy needed to work the farm. Conner's formal education ended after 8th grade, but he had learned lessons on that Kentucky farm that no classroom could teach: patience, endurance, and an understanding of distance and terrain that would prove invaluable in combat. Before the war, Conner had known the rhythm of agricultural life, the careful reading of weather and land, the understanding of how to make do with whatever was at hand. He worked alongside his father and brothers, clearing timber, planting tobacco, and raising livestock on land that gave grudgingly even to those who knew it well. When the Great Depression hit rural Kentucky, it simply made harder an existence that had never been easy. Conner joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, part of Roosevelt's New Deal program that put young men to work on conservation projects. There he learned discipline, teamwork, and how to work alongside men from different backgrounds, skills that would serve him well in the Army. On March 1, 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, Conner entered the U.S. Army at Louisville, Kentucky. He was 21 years old, stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, weighed 145 pounds, and possessed a quiet determination that his fellow soldiers would come to recognize as unbreakable. Assigned to Company K, 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, Conner completed basic training at Fort Lewis, Washington. His performance was unremarkable in the sense that he did not seek attention or accolades. He simply did whatever was asked of him, completely and without complaint. On October 23, 1942, Conner and his division departed from Norfolk, Virginia, aboard ships headed for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. The crossing took 16 days. On November 8, 1942, the 3rd Infantry Division landed at Fadala, Morocco, beginning what would become one of the longest combat deployments of any American unit in World War II. The North African campaign proved to be a brutal introduction to modern warfare. Temperatures soared to 120 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and plummeted at night. Water was scarce, and disease ravaged the ranks as thoroughly as enemy fire. Conner experienced combat for the first time, discovering that he possessed a quality that would mark him throughout the war: the ability to remain calm and focused when others panicked. While some men froze under fire, Conner moved with deliberate purpose, assessing situations and acting on them. The division pushed eastward across North Africa, fighting German and Italian forces in a campaign that would last until May 1943. Conner earned his first Silver Star for gallantry during fighting in October 1943. The citation noted his leadership of a reconnaissance patrol that successfully identified enemy positions despite being heavily outnumbered. His ability to read terrain, learned on the hills of Kentucky, translated seamlessly to the wadis and ridges of Tunisia. In July 1943, the division participated in the invasion of Sicily. The fighting was house to house through ancient towns, with German defenders making every building a fortress. Conner's unit suffered heavy casualties, but he continued forward, earning the respect of men who recognized genuine courage when they witnessed it. But the real crucible came in Italy. On September 9, 1943, the 3rd Infantry Division landed at Salerno as part of the Allied invasion of mainland Italy. The Germans were waiting in prepared positions. The battle for the beachhead raged for days, with German counterattacks nearly pushing the Allies back into the sea. Conner fought continuously for 72 hours, manning positions, leading counterattacks, and pulling wounded men to safety. He earned his 2nd Silver Star during this period for actions his commander described as exemplary heroism under the most adverse conditions. The Italian campaign became a grinding advance up the peninsula. In January 1944, the division participated in the amphibious landing at Anzio, an operation that instead became a 4-month siege. Conner earned his 3rd Silver Star on January 30, 1944, for leading an assault against German positions despite intense mortar fire. On March 6, 1944, he was wounded for the first time when German shell fragments struck him during a bombardment. He received a Purple Heart but refused evacuation. By summer 1944, Conner had been in continuous combat for 18 months. He was promoted to Technical Sergeant, a recognition of his combat leadership and his ability to keep men alive while accomplishing difficult missions. He was wounded again in August 1944 and again in September, each time refusing to be evacuated. He had become one of those soldiers whose presence reassured others. In August 1944, the 3rd Infantry Division received orders to withdraw from Italy for another amphibious operation, this time into southern France. On August 15, 1944, Operation Dragoon commenced with landings near Saint-Tropez. The division pushed rapidly north through the Rhône Valley, liberating French towns and villages as they advanced. Then something extraordinary happened. Conner's battalion commander, Major Lloyd Ramsey, recognized that the battle-tested sergeant possessed exceptional qualities. Based on his combat record and natural leadership abilities, Ramsey recommended Conner for a battlefield commission. On September 11, 1944, Technical Sergeant Garlin Murl Conner became 2nd Lieutenant Garlin Murl Conner, earning his commission through demonstrated battlefield competence rather than officer candidate school. He earned his 4th Silver Star that same day for leading an assault over 300 yards of fire-swept ground, actions his commander described as displaying grim ferocity. By late November 1944, the 3rd Infantry Division had reached Strasbourg, the first Allied unit to reach the Rhine River, but the Germans still held the Colmar Pocket, a 65-kilometre-long and 50-kilometre-deep salient west of the river, centred on the town of Colmar. The task of eliminating this pocket fell primarily to the French First Army, with American units attached to provide additional strength. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was one of the coldest in European memory. Temperatures in Alsace plummeted to -20 degrees Celsius, with snow accumulating to depths of 3 feet. The men of the 3rd Infantry Division, exhausted after more than 2 years of continuous combat, moved into positions in the frozen landscape in mid-December 1944. Lieutenant Conner had been assigned as the Battalion Intelligence Officer, a position known as S2. This role involved collecting and analysing information about enemy positions, strength and intentions. Conner proved exceptionally good at this work, his powers of observation making him an excellent intelligence officer. He would go forward to observe German positions himself, taking risks that many intelligence officers would have delegated to scouts. On January 20, 1945, French forces began the offensive to clear the Colmar Pocket. The 3rd Infantry Division's role was to attack southeast, cross the Ill River, bypass Colmar to the north, and open a path for French armoured divisions to reach the Rhine. Conner's battalion made slow progress through January 22nd and 23rd, fighting through brutal cold and determined German resistance. By the evening of January 23rd, Conner's battalion had established positions near the small village of Houssen, several miles northwest of Colmar. Intelligence reports indicated that German forces in the area were disorganized and retreating. None of the intelligence indicated what was actually about to happen. The sun rose late on January 24, 1945. Its light filtered through heavy clouds. The temperature stood at approximately -15 degrees Celsius. At approximately 8 a.m., forward observers reported movement in the woods to the east. Within minutes, the full scope of the German attack became clear. 6 Tiger tanks, their broad tracks crushing through the snow, emerged from the tree line, followed by waves of German infantry. The tanks' 88mm cannons began firing at American positions. At the battalion command post, Major Ramsey immediately recognized the severity of the situation. The American positions were not prepared to withstand an attack of this magnitude. The only weapon that could stop the German tanks was artillery, but artillery fires required accurate observation and adjustment, which meant someone needed to be forward where they could see the targets. Ramsey called for volunteers to go forward as a forward observer to direct artillery fire. Going forward meant running through the impact area of German artillery. It meant exposing oneself to machine gun fire, rifle fire, and tank cannons. Most critically, it meant positioning oneself ahead of the American defensive line, where capture or death were the most likely outcomes. Lieutenant Conner immediately volunteered. At 25 years old, he had survived 28 months of continuous combat, earning 4 Silver Stars, 3 Purple Hearts, and the Distinguished Service Cross for previous actions. He had every reason to let someone else take this mission. Instead, he grabbed a telephone, a radio, and a large spool of telephone wire, and prepared to move forward. Another soldier, Private Robert Dutil, volunteered to accompany Conner, helping to unreel the wire as they advanced. Conner and Dutil left the relative safety of the command post and ran directly toward the enemy assault. German artillery shells were falling in a steady barrage, their explosions throwing up geysers of snow and frozen earth. Conner ran in a zigzag pattern, unreeling the telephone wire behind him, maintaining the communications link with the battalion command post. Dutil stayed with him for part of the journey, but the fire was too intense. Most accounts indicate Dutil fell back after the first 200 yards, leaving Conner to complete the journey alone. Eyewitnesses later reported seeing trees exploding around Conner, their trunks shattered by German shells. They saw him stagger but continue forward, driven by determination that seemed superhuman. First Sergeant Harold Miller, who observed from the command post, would later write that watching Conner advance through that barrage was one of the most courageous acts he had ever witnessed. "He just kept going," Miller wrote. "Shells were landing all around him, and he just kept going forward." Conner reached the American front line, where soldiers in foxholes were preparing to face the German assault. He did not stop. He continued forward another 30 yards, past the defensive positions, until he reached a shallow irrigation ditch. The ditch was perhaps 18 inches deep, barely enough to provide cover from small arms fire. But it was forward of the American positions, which meant Conner would have an unobstructed view of the German advance. He dropped into the ditch, set up his telephone, and began calling fire missions to the battalion command post. The German tanks were now clearly visible, 6 massive Tigers advancing in a line with infantry moving behind them. The 600 German infantrymen following the tanks were veterans, many wearing the winter camouflage of Eastern Front fighters. They moved with the confidence of men who had broken many defensive positions. Conner calmly began calling artillery coordinates to the battalion fire direction center. The American artillery available consisted primarily of 105mm howitzers from the division artillery and heavier 155mm guns from corps artillery. These weapons, positioned several miles to the rear, could not see their targets. They relied entirely on forward observers like Conner to tell them where to shoot. The first salvos fell, and Conner made rapid adjustments. "Drop 100, left 50," he would say, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. The artillery crews responded to his corrections with professional efficiency. Conner adjusted fire onto the leading German tanks with remarkable precision. The 105mm and 155mm shells began landing among the German formation. Artillery could damage tracks, periscopes, and external equipment. More importantly, artillery could devastate the infantry following behind the tanks. High-explosive shells detonating in the air and on the ground created lethal zones of fragmentation. The German infantry, seeing the artillery falling around them, sought cover. But the open, snow-covered fields offered little protection. The German attack began to slow as casualties mounted. Conner continued directing fire, his voice steady on the telephone as he called corrections. He was now surrounded by the sounds of battle, the crash of artillery shells, the distinctive crack of German tank cannons, the stutter of machine guns. His position in the irrigation ditch gave him an excellent view of the battlefield, but it also made him terribly vulnerable. A German soldier came within 5 yards of Conner's position before being shot by an American defender. German tank commanders began firing their cannons and machine guns at suspected observation posts. Shells struck near Conner's ditch, showering him with debris. Machine gun rounds kicked up snow along the edge of his position, but the shallow ditch kept him alive. He pressed himself against the frozen earth and continued his work. For 3 hours, Conner remained in that ditch. Lieutenant Harold Wigetman, observing from a position behind the front line, would later write in his sworn statement, "With icy self-control, he kept telephoning his directions, although he must have seen that the Germans would have killed him before he could get on his feet." The German attack came in waves. When the first assault was driven back by artillery fire, the Germans regrouped and came again. Each time, Conner directed artillery onto the attacking forces with devastating effect. His familiarity with terrain allowed him to judge distances and positions with remarkable accuracy. His calm under pressure allowed him to make precise corrections, even as shells landed around him. The crisis came when the Germans mounted their final, all-out assault. Frustrated by their inability to break through, German commanders committed everything in a desperate attempt to smash through the American line. The 6 Tigers rumbled forward at maximum speed. Behind them, the remaining infantry rose and charged. Major Ramsey, watching from the command post, could see that the German attack was about to overrun Conner's position. He called Conner on the telephone and ordered him to withdraw. But Conner refused the order. His response, captured in multiple sworn statements from witnesses, would become legendary. "No, sir. Blanket my position." Blanket my position was forward observer terminology for concentrating all available artillery fire on one's own location. It was a tactic of absolute last resort, to be used only when being overrun and when the destruction of the enemy was more important than one's own survival. Ramsey, understanding what Conner was requesting, faced an agonizing decision. Granting the request meant almost certainly killing his own officer, a man he had personally recommended for commission. Refusing meant potentially allowing the German attack to succeed, which could result in the destruction of the entire battalion. Ramsey gave the order. Every available artillery piece in range was directed to fire on Conner's coordinates. What followed was one of the most intense artillery concentrations of the Colmar Pocket campaign. Shells from 105mm and 155mm howitzers poured down on a target area centered on Conner's irrigation ditch. The barrage was so heavy that observers described it as creating a continuous roar. The ground heaved and shook. Smoke and snow created a blinding storm. The German attack disappeared into the maelstrom. Conner, lying in his ditch as American shells landed mere feet from his position, continued to adjust fire. Multiple accounts describe how shells landed within 5 yards of him, how the concussion from near misses left him deafened and dazed, how shrapnel struck all around him. But he did not stop. Even as friendly artillery shells exploded around him, Conner maintained his telephone connection and continued calling corrections. His voice, according to those who heard it, remained calm and professional. The German attack broke. The combination of sustained artillery fire and the inability to advance through the barrage proved too much. The Tigers, their accompanying infantry shattered, began to withdraw. German soldiers who had survived the artillery fire retreated through the snow, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The American defensive line held firm. When the artillery fire lifted, silence fell across the battlefield. The smoke slowly cleared, revealing a scene of devastation. The snow-covered fields were cratered by shell impacts. German bodies lay scattered across the approach routes. Of the 6 Tiger tanks, none had reached the American positions. Soldiers from the American lines moved cautiously forward. They found Conner still in his irrigation ditch, covered in dirt and snow, his uniform torn by shell fragments but alive. He had suffered numerous small wounds from shell fragments and was severely affected by shell shock. His hearing was damaged. He was shaking from exposure and from the after effects of adrenaline. But he had survived. The cost to the German attackers was staggering. Official reports documented approximately 50 Germans killed and more than 100 wounded. The 6 Tiger tanks were destroyed or captured. The 600-man German assault force was shattered as an effective combat unit. The threat to the 3rd Division's advance had been eliminated. Major Ramsey immediately recommended Conner for the Medal of Honor. In a letter written just days after the action, Ramsey stated, "I've never seen a man with as much courage and ability as he had. I usually don't brag on my officers, but this is one officer nobody could brag enough about." The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was processed through channels and was eventually reduced to the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's 2nd highest award for valor. The reasons for this reduction remain unclear, though historians have noted that another soldier in the same division, Audie Murphy, performed a similar action just 2 days later and received the Medal of Honor. On February 10, 1945, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commander of the U.S. 7th Army, personally presented Conner with the Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony at division headquarters. But the Battle of January 24th was not Conner's last action. Less than 2 weeks later, on February 3, 1945, Conner assumed command of a badly disorganized rifle company and led it in an assault over 200 yards of fire-swept ground, earning his 4th Silver Star for killing 12 Germans and capturing 75 more. By March 1945, even the army recognized that Conner had given everything he had. He had been in combat for 28 consecutive months. He had fought in 10 campaigns and participated in 4 amphibious assault landings. He had officially been wounded 3 times and received 3 Purple Hearts, though he claimed to have been wounded 7 times. His military records, which would have clarified the exact number, were destroyed in a fire at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis in 1973. Conner was sent back to the United States in March 1945 and was honorably discharged on June 22, 1945. He returned to Clinton County, Kentucky, where the community organized a celebration in his honor. The keynote speaker at the event was Sergeant Alvin C. York, the most famous Medal of Honor recipient from World War I, who traveled from his home in nearby Pall Mall, Tennessee, to honor the young soldier. At that celebration in May 1945, a 15-year-old farm girl named Pauline Wells attended with her family. They came by horse-drawn wagon to see the returning war hero. When Pauline first saw the small, quiet man everyone was celebrating, she turned to her mother and said, "My God, Mama, that little guy couldn't have done all of what they said he'd done." But Conner was persistent. He visited the Wells family farm every day. After a 1-week courtship on July 9, 1945, Conner married Lyda Pauline Wells. She was 16 years old. He was 26. The Conners settled on Indian Creek, several miles north of Albany, near the Cumberland River. The home they moved into had no electricity and no running water. They worked the farm using mules and horses. In 1950, the U.S. government purchased their property for the impoundment of Lake Cumberland, and the Conners moved to the Rowland community in southeastern Clinton County, where they ran a 36-acre farm. Garlin Conner never spoke about the war. When neighbors and friends asked about his service, he would deflect the questions. "We went over there, we did what we had to do, and it needs to stay over there." He refused to watch war movies. When 4th of July fireworks went off, he would close the windows and retreat to the back of the house. He turned away when veterans gathered to share stories. His son Paul grew up barely knowing anything about his father's service. A photograph hung on the wall showing a young soldier in dress uniform with ribbons on his chest, but when Paul asked about it, His father would change the subject. But Conner channeled his leadership into civilian life. He served as president of the Clinton County Farm Bureau for 17 years. He was active in the Paralyzed Veterans of America and the Disabled American Veterans, traveling throughout the region to help disabled veterans secure their pension benefits. He and Pauline volunteered countless hours to assist veterans who needed someone to navigate the bureaucracy of the Veterans Administration. The physical toll of the war was evident. Conner walked with a limp from old wounds. He was handicapped from injuries that never fully healed and from heart surgery he underwent in 1979. The concussive trauma from artillery shells had left him with hearing problems and what would now be recognized as traumatic brain injury. He suffered from what was then called battle fatigue and what is now understood as post-traumatic stress disorder. Pauline understood. In World War II and Korea, they didn't recognize PTSD like they did in Vietnam, she would later say. But I've always said if anybody ever had PTSD, he did, because many times he'd wake up in the night with nightmares. Conner died on November 5, 1998, at the age of 79, after battling kidney failure and diabetes. He was buried in Memorial Hill Cemetery in Albany, Kentucky. Only a small group of veterans and family members attended the funeral of a man whose heroism had saved hundreds of lives. What happened next would take more than 2 decades and involve people Conner had never met. In the fall of 1996, a former Green Beret named Richard Chilton contacted the Conner family. Chilton was researching the service of his uncle, Private Gordon Roberts, who had been killed at Anzio in 1944. Roberts had served in Conner's unit, and Chilton hoped the Conners might have information about his uncle's death. Pauline suggested Chilton look through her late husband's military records, which were stored in a cardboard box at the bottom of a duffel bag in the back of a living room closet. Chilton was astonished by what he found: the 4 silver stars, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Purple Hearts, the citations describing extraordinary heroism in combat after combat, the letters from commanders praising Conner's courage, the sworn statements from witnesses to his actions on January 24, 1945. Chilton, himself a decorated veteran, understood that Conner's Distinguished Service Cross should have been a Medal of Honor. He began a campaign to have the award upgraded. He was joined by Luther Conner, a cousin and attorney, and by Walton Chip Haddix, a neighbor from Albany. The campaign faced immediate obstacles. Military regulations required that Medal of Honor recommendations be submitted within 3 years of the action. Conner's action had occurred in 1945, more than 50 years earlier. Additionally, the recommendation had already been submitted once and reduced to the Distinguished Service Cross. The team discovered that the original recommendation had been accompanied by sworn statements from 3 eyewitnesses: First Sergeant Harold Miller, Lieutenant Harold Wigetman, and Private Robert Dutil. These statements, signed on February 9, 1945, just 16 days after Conner's action, provided detailed accounts of what they had witnessed. But the Army Board for Correction of Military Records had never reviewed these statements. The team submitted a formal request in 1997. The board rejected it, stating that too much time had passed. An appeal in 2000 was also rejected. Pauline, devastated but determined, continued fighting. The campaign gained support from an expanding circle of advocates. Military historians, including Doug Sterner, examined Conner's case and concluded the Medal of Honor should have been awarded. Members of Congress from Kentucky, including Senator Mitch McConnell, took up the cause. Authors who wrote about World War II included Conner's story in their books. In 2014, a Kentucky district court ruled that Conner was not eligible based on a technicality. Pauline had waited too long to present evidence. The legal battle seemed lost. But Pauline refused to give up. In 2015, new evidence emerged. Researchers discovered additional documents in the National Archives that corroborated the eyewitness accounts. The Army Board for Correction of Military Records reversed its earlier decisions and recommended that Conner's Distinguished Service Cross be upgraded to the Medal of Honor. In 2017, the recommendation went to the Secretary of the Army, who approved it. To ensure prompt implementation, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018 included an amendment waiving the time limit to award the Medal of Honor to Conner for his actions on January 24, 1945. On March 29, 2018, the White House announced that President Donald Trump would award the Medal of Honor to First Lieutenant Garlin Murl Conner in a ceremony at the White House. Because Conner had died 20 years earlier, the medal would be presented to his widow, Pauline, who was then 89 years old. The ceremony took place on June 26, 2018, in the East Room of the White House. Pauline Conner attended, along with her son Paul, 4 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. Richard Chilton, who had begun the campaign 22 years earlier, was there. Walton Haddix and Luther Conner attended. Senator Mitch McConnell and other members of Kentucky's congressional delegation came to witness the honor. President Trump read from Conner's citation and spoke about the Kentucky native who had become one of the war's greatest heroes. "We pay tribute to this Kentucky farm boy who stared down evil with the strength of a warrior and the heart of a true hero," the president said. He quoted from Major Ramsey's letter, "There is no doubt that Lieutenant Conner should have been awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. One of the most disappointing regrets of my career is not having the Medal of Honor awarded to the most outstanding soldier I've ever had the privilege of commanding." Pauline Conner accepted the Medal of Honor from the president. In a room filled with military officers, government officials, and family members, she held the medal that represented not just her husband's courage, but her own persistence in ensuring his story would not be forgotten. She had outlived her husband by 20 years and devoted much of that time to this mission. The medal itself is now displayed at the Kentucky Military History Museum in Frankfort, ensuring that future generations will learn about Garlin Murl Conner. The U.S. Army honored Conner in 2012 by naming a maintenance facility at Fort Benning, Georgia, as Conner Hall. The story of Garlin Murl Conner reveals fundamental truths about heroism and sacrifice. A subsistence farmer's son with an 8th-grade education proved capable of making split-second tactical decisions under pressure that saved hundreds of lives. His rural upbringing, which might have seemed a disadvantage, actually provided him with skills that proved invaluable in combat: patience, to read terrain, understanding of distances, and a work ethic that would not quit. The calculations of his action are clear. One man, armed only with a telephone and his knowledge of artillery, stopped 6 tanks and 600 infantrymen. The artillery he directed killed approximately 50 enemy soldiers and wounded more than 100 others, breaking the German attack at a critical moment. Had the German counterattack succeeded, it would have destroyed the 3rd Battalion and potentially reversed the Allied advance in the Colmar Pocket. But Conner's decision to call artillery fire on his own position represents something beyond tactical calculation. It was a moral choice, a decision to value the lives of his fellow soldiers more than his own survival. Military ethicists have studied this decision as an example of the ultimate expression of the warrior ethos, the willingness to die so that others might live. The broader context of the Colmar Pocket campaign provides additional perspective. The battle to clear the pocket lasted from January 20th to February 9th, 1945. Allied forces suffered approximately 15,000 casualties, including 2,000 killed. The 3rd Infantry Division alone suffered more than 2,000 casualties during the campaign. The strategic importance of eliminating the pocket was significant. It allowed Allied commanders to concentrate forces for the final push into Germany, helping to bring the war to a more rapid conclusion. Conner's story also demonstrates the disconnect between military decoration and actual heroism. The medals the military bestows are imperfect indicators of courage. Bureaucracy, chance, the quality of one's chain of command, and simple luck all play roles in determining who receives what recognition. Conner performed Medal of Honor-worthy actions on January 24, 1945, but received the Distinguished Service Cross. Only through extraordinary persistence and the discovery of mislaid documentation was the record corrected 73 years later. The question arises, how many other heroes never received the recognition they deserved? How many men performed extraordinary actions that were witnessed by comrades who were themselves killed? How many citations were downgraded because of quotas or administrative error? Conner's choice to remain silent about his service reflects a cultural attitude toward heroism that has largely disappeared. He had every right to tell his story, to bask in community gratitude, to leverage his decorations into opportunities. Instead, He chose to be simply a farmer, a husband, a father, and a neighbour. His identity was not built around his wartime service. This humility characterized many of Conner's generation. They had done what they believed was necessary, and having done it, they moved on. The idea of constantly referencing one's past achievements would have struck them as unseemly. But this cultural attitude also meant that many stories were lost. Conner's story, because it was ultimately documented and recognized, provides a window into this lost world. Through his experience, we can begin to understand what millions of others experienced but never described. The fear, the exhaustion, the moral calculations, the aftermath of trauma, all of these elements of Conner's story were shared by countless others who served. The lesson of Garlin Conner's life is about the power of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. He had no special advantages, no elite training, no particular destiny. He was simply a rural Kentucky native who learned to do his duty, who developed the skills and character to lead others, and who, when faced with an impossible situation, chose to do what needed to be done regardless of the cost to himself. His story reminds us that heroism is not the exclusive province of the naturally gifted or the highly educated. It is available to anyone willing to put others before themselves, to act with courage when fear would counsel retreat, and to persist in the face of overwhelming odds. Today, when we tell the story of January 24th, 1945, we are telling a story about human potential and the power of courage. Garlin Murl Conner took an action that military doctrine would have considered suicidal. He called artillery fire on his own position and survived to see the battle won. In doing so, he proved that sometimes the impossible idea is actually the only idea that will work, that calculated risk becomes necessity when the alternative is certain defeat, and that one person in the right place at the right time with the will to act can change the outcome of a battle. His legacy endures not in monuments or statues, but in the lives saved on January 24, 1945. The men of the 3rd Battalion who survived that day went on to live full lives, to raise families, to contribute to their communities. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren owe their existence in part to the courage of a man most of them never heard of. This multiplication of consequence is the true measure of Conner's impact, one act of courage creating ripples that extend through generations. The Medal of Honor that Pauline Conner received on June 26, 2018, carries the inscription "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty." Those words capture the essence of what Conner did. He went beyond what duty required, beyond what anyone could reasonably ask, and he did so knowing the likely cost. The story of Garlin Murl Conner is ultimately a story about redemption fulfilled. Not his redemption, for he needed none, having acted with honour throughout his life. Rather, it is the redemption of a system that failed to recognise his heroism when it occurred, but ultimately corrected that failure. It is the redemption of a family that refused to let their father's and husband's story be forgotten. And it is the redemption of a nation that paused, 73 years after the fact, to acknowledge the debt it owed to a Kentucky farmer's son, who stopped a German tank column in a frozen field in France. The idea wasn't crazy, it was necessary. And on January 24, 1945, Garlin Murl Conner proved it. That belief and that proof echo across the decades as a testament to what ordinary people can achieve when they choose to be extraordinary.